My name is Kern Smith. I am the VP of Global Presales at Zimperium. Yeah, this is a really interesting one, and I'm afraid it kind of shows a growing trend of what we're seeing. This wasn't necessarily a breach of AT&T per se, right? It looks like the data was coming through a third party that was hosting or had access to AT&T data. And then through some mechanism, it's still a little unclear of what the actual mechanism of the compromise or the breach was. The running theory is some level of credential compromise at this point, but the attackers were able to gain access to AT&T data. But as far as what I think organizations need to be concerned about, I think this shows it's not just about the data that you're hosting, but it's who you're sharing data with and the third-party sources that you're leveraging. And even if they have all the controls in place, there's a level of there's only so much you can do from a pure security perspective. So I think it's important that organizations really take a look at their overall security approach, both how they're treating their data, how they're protecting their endpoints on both the traditional and the mobile side, but also authentication and credential items, because ultimately it's not just, hey, let's enact multi-factor authentication, we're safe. It's we do that plus anti-phishing controls, plus risk verification, et cetera. No, it's a great question around as far as what can enterprises do to kind of protect themselves and their users. And I think in this particular example, it's a bit tough because you're talking about data that the enterprise never really had direct control over in the first place. However, I think in broad strokes, it speaks to identifying where your enterprise data is being shared, either intentionally or unintentionally, right, through the use of third-party tooling or code and whatnot in your different levels of the app stack. But the other side is, and I think from a security personnel side, that kind of makes me a bit concerned, especially with the advent of AI and large language models, is that attackers could very easily take this data, especially if it contains call logs or text information, throw it through a learning model and start identifying trends of who's communicating to who to start targeting people and organizations. And I think that's where it gets into, well, if I can target somebody with a targeted smishing campaign that's in context of who they're talking to and how they're talking to them as an organization, I kind of need to make sure I have some method of either detecting or blocking that type of campaign at the endpoint that it's existing at, because ultimately the data that was exposed was those mobile devices and their phone numbers. And that's kind of an actionable thing that me as an enterprise, I'm looking at how do I protect my users against. Mobile device or MDMs, or kind of what's broadly termed as a UEM or Unified Endpoint Management, really can't do anything about this because in the end, they're a management tool. They're basically asset tracking and provisioning utilities to automatically configure email profiles, what have you. The tooling I think that can help, though, is, again, there's no way to prevent the telco from collecting this data because they need it to do their job. But in the event that you have some level of a breach where now you have targeted information that be used for a much more targeted campaign, that's where I think tooling like a mobile threat defense can come into play, because now it's about preventing at the endpoint an attacker from succeeding with a smishing campaign or a phishing campaign that comes into play, along with any of the other targeted breaches that devices. The most common thing that comes up, or the one example that was in the news and keeps coming up, especially in the U.S. federal government, is things like TikTok, right? What are the third parties that are on the device that they are concerned about aggregating data? And this is where we're kind of moving from the telco aspect of, hey, AT&T needs this data to do their job, and candidly, the breach wasn't necessarily about AT&T. It was kind of through the third party on the Snowflake side that comes into play. So there's a level of risk that you kind of have to accept as a cost of, this is just what it is doing business for the phones to operate. But there's also, to your point, a conversation that I think opens up to say, okay, for these devices, what are the third-party tools that we're using on these devices? Are they meeting spec? Is there a vulnerability? What's the third-party tooling within the third-party tooling that could expose our data? So level of vetting of, say, you mentioned HIPAA as an example. Well, how are the doctors communicating patient lab results? What's the third party app they're using, and does that meet spec, or is there a risk to the organization? That's the type of thing that proactively you can get involved in. Because again, we're looking at AT&T because of the depth and the breadth of the conversation, but the reality is that the same mobile data that was being accessed, be it from a phone number or things of that nature, A lot of third-party apps may have access to that. Not saying they have access to the call logs or the text chains, but the type of data that can be weaponized later on is something that has access. So I really need to understand what my risk posture is on these devices and these assets, and then I can start looking at proactive defense for those type of phishing campaigns and credential compromise.